Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the Infiniti Fast Forward webinar series. Appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join us today. My name's Steve Kessler and I'm going to host the program. We have a great topic today. We in this industry have spent a lot of time and effort and money on a variety of different ways to gather data. Telematics, we have cameras, we have ways to know how our truck is running, what kind of miles to gallon we're getting, whether we get hard brakes. We get all kinds of great data. In fact, a huge amount of data. And that's a great tool to have as far as helping to improve safety in our companies. But at the same time, if we don't handle that data correctly, there could be some issues that might arise, especially if we're sadly in a position and involved in a lawsuit. So we're going to talk about telematics, whether it's a safety tool or a legal landmine. So that's our topic for today. A couple of housekeeping items, and then I'll introduce our panel here. First of all, everybody that's joined us today is muted, so we can't hear you. So if you want to communicate with us, you can put your information in the chat box down there, or you can use the Q&A box if you'd rather pose your question there. We can see all those comments here on our side, and we'll try to address those questions generally toward the end of the program. We'll kind of leave some time for Q&A then. And just so everybody knows, the webinar is recorded. So we'll make sure to send out a link to everybody that attended and registered so you can share it with folks that couldn't join us today. Let me introduce first my co-host, Mark Ray. Most of you know Mark. He's been on pretty much all of our webinars over the years. Mark's an industry veteran, certified director of safety, and is involved in a lot of groups as it relates to safety and trucking, and stays very active in the business. He was a transportation executive for more than 35 years, I believe. So, Mark, what's your thoughts about our topic today?
I was talking to Doug before we started. I get asked the same question multiple times these days, which is what do I keep and what can I delete and what's actionable and what's not actionable as the data, the metrics, the dash cams, the thresholds is overwhelming and consuming. So hopefully today we can get some insight on sorting out all that to determine what is actionable and what do we keep and what can we delete. So it's a great topic and really looking forward to Rob and Doug's presentation today.
Great, thanks, Mark. Let me just go ahead and introduce our experts here today. I'd like to first of all introduce Rob Abbott. Rob's the Vice President of Corporate Strategy for Fleetworthy, which is a transportation services company that provides industry-leading solutions for fleets to manage safety, compliance, and efficiency. Rob came to Fleetworthy from Lytx, which is the largest provider of cloud-connected video event recorders to the trucking industry. So he's got a lot of experience with the stuff that we're going to talk about. And there he served as Vice President of Sales for Strategic Fleets. Prior to that, prior to Lytx, Rob was Vice President of Safety for the American Trucking Associations, which, as you all know, is the largest trade association representing the trucking industry. And in that capacity, he promoted and defended interests of the nation's leading fleets on issues such as hours of service regulations, CSA program. Abbott had previously worked as a safety professional in the trucking industry and most recently was a vice president of safety for TransForce. So Rob, welcome. Our next guest is Mr. Doug Marcello. Doug's an attorney and a shareholder at Saxton and Stump law firm. He's a member of their trucking and commercial transportation group. They defend trucking companies in both central Pennsylvania and throughout the country. A trial counsel in 35 different states. Doug handles all aspects of the trucking industry's legal needs, from immediately responding to accidents to working with businesses to mitigate risk and litigating cases through a jury trial. Doug also has earned a commercial driver's license, which provides him with insight into the challenges of operating a tractor trailer and the mechanical components of that equipment. Doug's the founder of the former Carlisle, Pennsylvania-based law firm Marcello and Cavisto, a boutique firm that handled only transportation law. After the firm's formation in 2005, it joined Saxton and Stump in August of 2022. The firm worked with transportation companies in trucking defense, transportation contracts, employment law, cargo claims, and CDL issues. He is also a member of the firm's commercial litigation group. So having said all that, Rob, I think I'm going to hand it over to you first. Welcome, and we're excited to hear what you got to say.
Well, thank you for the very kind introduction, Steve. Doug and I really welcome the opportunity to talk fleets about these questions and issues because they are so prevalent. We get asked them a lot. I'll skip past our self-introductions because you did such a fine job there, but I want to tell you I'm grateful that Doug is here to join us. Doug is one of my favorite attorneys in the trucking industry, but as Doug knows, that bar is very, very low. So, you know, it's the best we can do here. You mentioned sort of the backdrop in telematics here, and that's really important. You know, the telematics really are really powerful tools. When you think about how it was 20, 30 years ago, we started out with critical event recorders, which only gave us data off the ECM. It told us data like hard braking, stopping, you know, weaving, swerving, that sort of thing, right? That came off the vehicle. But now we're getting so much more. We're getting following distance and lane departures and speed and so many other things. But the real value of it is not just how much we get, it's the ability of those systems then to take all that data, all these elements of risk, right? Every little swerve, every little overspeed, every little following distance is too close, and say, okay, where are they occurring? Where are the patterns? Which people are they occurring with? Which locations, which vehicles, which operations, so that we can act on them, right? So that we can say, look, the 80% is not problematic. They are anomalies, they're one-offs, they're minor events, but we see patterns with people or with operations or in locations, and that gives us really a tool that's very, very powerful and effective. So the data is much better now and really very powerful. So it's not a tool that we can ignore. The second is that the systems now provide driver-centric behavior change. So it used to be that what happened is that, and you may remember this from the early days where, you know, a fleet manager would be sitting inside in front of a Qualcomm system and it would produce a spreadsheet of critical event reports that would say, here's all your hard braking line by line, right? It just looked like a spreadsheet. Well, now the system actually in real time detects risky behaviors, and depending on the configuration or the setting, will actually alert the driver in the moment with a little bing or a noise or a written, a vocal statement, an oral statement that says, hey, increase your following distance, or hey, you're weaving across the lines. That's important because it's so timely, right? Is that we all know that, you know, to tap on the shoulder in the moment is so much more effective than a manager coaching a driver to something ultimately 2 or 3 days later, long after the context is lost, right? The other is that it gives us data to really focus on countermeasures and individual follow-up. So the patterns tell us, hey, we have lots of X, Y, or Z going on. How do we improve our fleet generally? But also, how do we work with these specific individuals? These are folks who have following distance issues. These are folks who are distracted or maybe have alertness issues. So it really helps us dial that in by comparing data from different systems. There's now aggregators that take the data from the cameras and the ECM and the MVR and the hours of service data and bring it all into one place to tell us that. But on a high level, the best benefit is there's crash reduction benefits by understanding the behaviors, understanding how we reduce risk and prevent crashes. And while today we'll talk about the risk of litigation and the risk that this data can be used against you in litigation, The reality is that using it is very powerful to prevent crashes that result in litigation to begin with, right? So we're reducing that exposure all the way. So it can't be ignored, and it's folly to think that doing so will get you in a better place. Um, Nonetheless, some fleets fear the data, and it's totally understandable if they don't have some resources devoted to it. They're basically creating a record of actionable data, and I think, Mark, you said that earlier. It's actionable data upon which they didn't act. It says, hey, you knew about these things. Why didn't you do something about it? You knew this driver was constantly having hard braking issues, and yet we later have a crash. It might also highlight patterns of risk, not just about individuals. So the first bullet point might be, hey, this driver had lots of following distance issues right before that rear end crash. But it also highlights patterns of risk that foreshadow crashes, right? So for instance, if you have a track record of all the speeding events in your fleet, it might foreshadow a speeding crash. And someone then could very easily mine that gold, a plaintiff's attorney that says, look, this is not an accident. This is a crash. And the difference is that, accidents aren't preventable and accidents aren't predictable. This was a crash. This was predictable and preventable, right? And moreover, they're concerned that the data could be used against them to demonstrate culpability, that they're creating a record to hand the plaintiff's attorney. And it's effectively what you said, Mark, earlier, which is, hey, I don't want to hand them a sword, right? But I know this is a very, very powerful tool. So the question is it better to have this telematics data or not? I will tell you from having worked with video telematics and having met with a number of fleets at a time when not everybody had video telematics, we heard a variety of opinions on that. We all know that cameras are really powerful because you have the exoneration and subrogation benefit of the video. It shows you, hey, that four-wheeler was at fault. I was doing everything I should have done right. I'm not at fault in this claim. That can be very, very powerful. But I've had plaintiffs' attorneys say, yes, but there will be times when that video shows I was at fault, and in their view, perhaps the consequence of that video will outset or overcome all the benefit you got from the exoneration video. I don't personally think that's true, but that is the concern. The other is I've had fleet professionals say, hey, look, I just had a crash today, and I'm fortunate that there wasn't a greater body of evidence in this crash because we are at fault, right? That setting aside, what they didn't see was all of the crashes they prevented by using the data and all of the times it helped them, especially if they needed to settle early, right? Because sometimes the facts help you settle early. It's always better to settle early. So my question to you, Doug, is, you've defended lots of fleets in cases like this. Is it better to have the data to help your fleet to prevent crashes and ultimately improve your fleet? Or are you creating this body of risk, and are you better not having it at all, not having the sword because somebody might use it against you? What says you, Doug Marcello?
Well, thank you very much for having me. Greatly appreciate it. And here's the deal. It used to be that you were operating mechanical devices that hauled freight. No more. You are operating technological devices that are spewing data as we go along. The problem for most companies is you're drinking from a fire hose. And whether you are aware of it or not, the data is there. You've got to do something with it. You got to get ahead of it. Here's the deal. Either you're going to write your narrative that the data tells you, or you're going to let the other folks get ahead of you, write that narrative, and guess what? It's not going to be good. I think what you have to look at is to use the data. Number one, the best defense we have is no accident. Use the data as was indicated by Rob to identify what are the potential risks here, and then take action about it proactively. Get ahead of it. You need to have a plan, as we're talking about. The first thing on the plan, what you need to do is to identify what data you have. And that sounds obvious, but I got to tell you, and I've had handling a significant accident today. It's a sophisticated company. They're ahead of it. But many times when I reach out to the companies, they don't know what data they have. They don't know what data is coming off their trucks, the OEM on there. Identify what you have. Number two, analyze it. Review the KPIs what are the key indicators that relate to the accidents you're having? If you're out in the Midwest running I-80, it's probably overspeeds. If you're up in the Northeast on the GW, it's probably hard brakes. The next thing you need to do on that is on the list, is to monitor that data. And I think, Rob, we have a bullet point number 2 there. There we go. Be sure you have a sound policy for how to address that risky behavior as well. Monitor what the points are that could lead to the accident, and then have a disciplinary policy that goes before that. The next thing we have, Rob, well, stick with that policy. When you make an exception, you are opening a chasm for the plaintiff attorney to drive through. It's a great guy. He didn't mean to do it. Well, we need drivers. That's the type of thing that's going to be a detonator when the lawsuit comes and you try to get through there. Monitor what you have seen as the KPIs with it. And then the toughest thing in today's world is to discipline and be consistent with repeat offenders and violators that we have. Again, I'm an attorney. I'm just telling you what's going to get you, your company in trouble. I appreciate where you are in terms of the driver situation. We have heard for years about there being a driver shortage, and there's debate on that. And I see that in the current literature that's out there. But if you look at the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, since it was founded several years ago, there are 200,000 drivers, 1/5 drivers, who are out there who tested positive and haven't done an SAP program to return. With the ELP, English Language Proficiency, the estimate in 2022 of the FMCSA, that encompasses 150,000 drivers. With the visa restrictions that are put on there, that may well be an overlap between the English language proficiency, but we're talking 200,000 to 300,000 drivers. If there's not a driver shortage going into it, we're looking at one coming out. The bottom line, though, is think how many miles your good drivers are going to have to operate in order to pay for that one bad driver if your company's still in business. Because these nuclear verdicts have become detonators of what we have out there. Key things: identify what data you have, analyze it, what relates to your accidents, monitor those key indicators, and discipline those who violate the policy inconsistently. Because even highly productive long-term employees, I had one time where there was a guy who just, back in the day, some of you older veterans will remember paper logs. Younger people, you can Google it to find out what they were. I said to the company, hey, it's your business, but this guy's going to get you in trouble. And they said, yeah, but if he runs legal, he will lose productivity, which was a euphemism for, we're making money off of violating the law on it. You can't do that anymore. The other thing is this. I'm saying before, a little bit ago, that the data's there. The billboard attorneys are doing programs, seminars. I monitor them. I see what's on the websites. In the programs they have out there, it was one particularly, trucking, a treasure trove of data. They then do individual sessions through the course of a morning to say what data you have, how to get it, from the cell phones to the ECMs, to the telematics, to the Bendix systems, all kind of data out there. They're going to go for it. They're going to get it. We need to get ahead of it. I just did a talk yesterday in Pittsburgh, and we hear a lot about tort reform, and we can strive to do that. But I think we need to flip the switch. When we get into court, what happens is, we have this situation where the plaintiff attorneys hire an expert, someone who goes around the country testifying at a number of their cases, to say what is the standard of care. And the standard of care, uncannily, is always just above what the trucking company had done in that accident. They give a subjective opinion. What we do to defend it for too long is we have been hiring our own opinion, our own experts, and they give their opinions as to what the standard of care is. So what do we got? 12 people in the jury box who don't know an ECM from a fifth wheel, or trying to decide which of the two experts really are the ones that are saying what the standard of care is. We're going to change that. The advent of AI is going to give us the ability to analyze the data and to come up with an objective standard for the standard of care, as opposed to the subjective standard that they put on. It's data driven versus anecdotal. It is 1,000 data points or millions of data points versus the few data points that a plaintiff's expert has come up. Too many times I hear folks go, well, we don't want this data, or we don't want to look at the data. It's what we call the discovery fallacy. If we see it or do something with it, then we'll have to turn it over in the lawsuit. Like I said before, they know what's there, they're getting it, and that's what they're going to get through on it. That's what you have to look out for and try to be careful. Have a plan, have a rationale. The worst thing you can do is not have a rationale. And we've done focus groups. Hypothetical case, rear end accident, somebody's killed. They have a disciplinary policy for overspeeds, hard brakes. The driver who was involved in that accident had several hard brakes, overspeeds over the policy of the company within the 2 weeks before the accident. But guess what? 35 truck fleet, one safety director, he couldn't stay on top of it. He was running behind. The jury was totally unforgiving. Yeah. Their theory is if you're out on the road making money, you better darn sure be that you're on top of this stuff. I think what we have with the potential with AI that's coming is the ability to not take your job, but do the parts of your job or do those elements that you don't have time for or that your company can't afford to do. It's going to amplify and maximize what your abilities are on that.
Well, Doug, if I could pause a minute, I think you touched on something there. So many fleets that I talked to said, we get it, man. If we have this data, we got to look at the KPIs, we got to manage to it, we got to monitor it, we got to discipline, we got to follow through. We just don't have the people to do it. So I'm encouraged to hear you say, hey, we're going to have tools that make that easier. And I think that's relieving for some who have fought for resources, especially in the current freight environment, right? But I also think what resonates with me about your message is that even if they don't buy new telematics tools, there's a ton of data already there. And I'll give you an example. I rented a car in Europe this summer, and it had not autonomous, it had adaptive speed control on it, which means that it binged every time I was going 1 kilometer per hour over the limit. And let's be quite honest here, I'm a scofflaw and hated that darn thing, so I turned it off. But there's an ECM record that I turned it off. And that ECM record would be used against me in court, right? So to your good point, hey, the first step is it's already there. Let's figure out what we got. And then to make it manageable, until we have the AI tools, you really got to look at the KPIs. So the providers, I think, are really good at narrowing in the KPIs. You can say, look, man, I need my top worst offenders in X, Y, and Z, right? And here's what I need on a dashboard. Help me make it manageable. You and I will talk in a minute about retention of that data, right? So you get the most value, but also that you don't, hold the sword for too long. But I think, leaning on the vendor to give you really sound, tight KPIs is the way to go, right?
Absolutely. And like you said, to work with your vendor in terms of, number one, identify the KPIs, and number two, have a dashboard to monitor it. Right. And in a pre-AI world, or until AI comes full-blown into this, it gives you a curation of the data you have so that you can identify what the issues are, what the potential problems are, and address those ahead of time proactively. Because even if the plaintiff then comes in and sues you, what are they doing? They are saying, not that you don't have a plan, but we don't agree with it. And the key thing with punitive damages is they are to punish and deter. The big cases that are out there, the nuclear verdicts don't arise from the accident. They arise from the argument by the plaintiff attorney that you have a systemic failure in your company. By getting ahead, curating, have a dashboard, you can show and have a plan for monitoring and enforcing. You can show that by actually doing that, there's no systemic failure. We may disagree in terms of the means, the KPIs, et cetera, but we're honestly doing what we can on this. We don't need to be sent a message by a jury verdict.
Well, we'll move on here in a second. My other takeaway there is don't rent a modern car when in Europe. Go for the 72 Fiat. It doesn't do any of this stuff, right?
Yeah, thank you, Rob Abbott and the discovery fallacy. Okay.
Yes, right. So tell us about the vulnerability. So flow fleets have to know, hey, I'm not wearing armor head to toe, right? What do they need to know? What do they need to think about?
Well, again, look at the risky behaviors that you have, what's going to come up with the accident, what your telematics are telling you on that. Be sure that you know and have a plan for what those are and identify them with your drivers. Keep on top of that. Next, look at some of the behaviors and are you not doing something about it? Because that's where it'll blow up. Again, we know the realities of the real world, but there was a large verdict in Philadelphia within the last couple of years where a driver sideswiped a truck parked on the berm of an interstate. The driver was going, I think it was about 7 miles an hour or so over the speed limit. And both experts admitted speed had nothing to do with the accident, yet they assessed 25 million in punitive damages against the driver and the company because they hadn't monitored and disciplined the speed gauge program that they had on the truck. Those are the things you need to get ahead of it. Good news to the story, we can't all count on that. That 25 million was docked down to 1 million by the court, saying 25 is excessive. But here's the deal. It wasn't even a trucking company, and it only had 4 trucks. So you can imagine what $1 million hit to that company was going to be. And in many states, most states, punitive damages are not insurable. Because the idea is you can't insure against behavior that gives damages of this nature. So you got to address this. Look to see if there's a pattern there. Are you seeing what's happening in the telematics and in your data that shows that there's a consistent pattern of what's going on there? And then ultimately, the ultimate question is, as Mark pointed out, should we keep it or should we toss it? Mark, true to being an attorney, that the first thing they teach you in law school, it depends. Okay.
Great. You could be in the weather. You could be a meteorologist, Doug.
If I'm going to be a meteorologist, it's going to be San Diego, Rob. It's always the same forecast.
Yes.
Now, here's the deal. Have a retention policy and a rationale for it is going through. For a lot of stuff, the FMCSA makes it easy for us. Logs, 6 months, other records, boom, down the line. But what you want to do, particularly with the data of behavior, is you don't have to keep all of the data. Big if, you keep a record of that occurred, this is what we did to address it, and we followed up to make sure that behavior was coached out of the driver. And I think that's where we need to do it. There's a jury consultant that I work with. He has found by focus groups that he does that the training, we have the initial training, then we have the remedial training for this. What he found is the ongoing training, it is better to do it in small doses on a very frequent basis, monthly at least, than just to do it quarterly or semi-annually at the safety meetings, which I speak at a lot of times to the driver meetings. Because the jury then has the impression, and I think it's demonstrated, your company has an ongoing concern for safety rather than just checking a box on it. And I think that's what we need to do.
So Doug, let me make sure I got this right. I mean, it seems to me that so many safety people feel overwhelmed by the data, right? So after they get their KPIs, Fred's speeding this much, and John's in the worst 25%, and that Marcelo guy, he's always following too closely, right? But really, you ought to pause for a minute and say, okay, do I have behaviors that are increasing, not decreasing, right? They're becoming more and more frequent. Like this is a sharp sword somebody hit over the head with. The other way are there things you're not doing anything with. And so you mentioned the speed data stuff, that reams of evidence of guys who were going 5 miles per over the limit. They didn't address them because they didn't think they were egregious or actionable, but it painted a bad picture, right? So you don't create that. You act on everything you've got that's provided to you. And you can lean on your provider to say, look, here's the things we want you to give us, and then look at the patterns. But in terms of the data, it strikes me that if you have a really good narrative, that keeping it a little longer is okay because you're showing, hey, we reduce this behavior over time. If you're struggling with it, hey, there's nothing to say you have to keep this stuff for more than 30 days, right? Or any period of time, right? You can use it as long as you want to use it, as long as you're consistent about getting rid of it. Yeah.
Yeah, have a consistent policy, be consistent in doing it, and go along those lines. But I think you hit on a good point, Rob, and that is to the extent you can use the data to show a declining line like we see in this slide, it gives you the opportunity to then use the data in your favor. The ultimate to me is to have the data, the narrative, and have the production with that, so that if and when the accident happens and you are called in for a deposition, uh, you can say in that deposition, "I'm glad you asked me that question. Let me tell you about what our company's really about," and we can go through that, and we can show where we were and where we are, and how that trend's going. So what we want to do that looks at a system where you're going through and being able to show that you have been productive, that you've paid attention. And again, the ultimate on this, because the theories from the reptile theory, the other to inflame a jury, is you need to send this trucking company a message, is to come up with a narrative that says, we get it. No message needed here. We're on top of it.
Yeah, so often I hear that plaintiffs' attorneys justify these jackpot claims by saying, look, you need to send a message to the industry to compel them, to teach them that they should be doing the right thing. You're helping the industry and society if you impose this massive verdict, right? So really what you're saying is create the narrative that if somebody says, hey, tell me about this, you say, well, I'm glad you asked. These drivers improved their behavior. We were on top of it. And the ones who didn't get it, they don't work here anymore. We made every attempt to improve and coach, but they don't work here anymore. But we've been very consistent in managing to these KPIs because we're on top of it, right?
Absolutely. It's got to be an overall narrative like that, Rob, because we don't hear about it. And, we complain and we rue our fate with regard to these nuclear verdicts in the industry we're in. But after the presentation I gave yesterday, there was a plaintiff attorney there who spoke to the insurance group. And his basic message is, I don't come up with anything. You give it to me. and went through in terms of, common practices that companies do that makes his case for him, or the inconsistencies he sees in the behaviors in this. And that's what we got to take out of it. And that's where the data can be the key to show us objectively what the story is and present that to the jury visually, as well as with the data itself.
Do you think, Doug, that fleets are culpable if they don't deploy certain technologies? I mean, I had some say, hey, I'm not going to deploy this stuff because it's going to create a record of evidence that I can't manage to. I'm going to be culpable because it's going to have actionable data, so I'm not even going to put it on. Is there an argument to be said, hey, a plaintiff's attorney is going to stuff that up your nose by saying, you could have deployed all this safety technology, you didn't because you don't care? Is that a risk?
I think it's a possible risk, potential risk. It's got to be weighed for a number of factors, and I think it can be addressed. Look, as an industry, Rob, what's the latest statistic I saw from ATA? $18 billion are invested by trucking companies in safety across the board. Right. And for the most part, I haven't seen as much an argument the failure to invest in certain technology as much as it is just taking the data that's there that company has and using it against them on that. And I think that's where a lot of it is. There are some circumstances, where folks may want to deactivate OEM data. Well, now you're getting into a whole nother situation.
Because you've actively done that, not passively purchased, right?
Actively reduce that. And then you got the folks, what's the most valuable truck out there? One before 2000, because there's no ECM on it.
Right.
And we have a whole world of those out there.
Sure.
So, that's what we're looking at on that. Now, I think the converse where you run into that, Rob, is you don't have the story to tell in response to the plaintiff in terms of what your investment in safety is.
Right.
And, back in, I think it was 2016, in the ironically named FAST Act, Congress told the FMCSA, hey, you are to give recognition to what trucking companies do beyond compliance.
Right.
You know, not just meet the regs, but let's reward the good folks.
Yeah.
The FMCSA hasn't figured out to come up with anything.
Yeah.
And did I say that was in the FAST Act in 2016?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
So,
yes,
so
10
that's
years ago.
what we're waiting for. And I
Well,
think that's what needs to be done, is to come up with some recognition for those who actually do.
well, you make a good point, except that the most valuable vehicle would be that 72 Fiat I mentioned earlier. But so I imagine the attendees have some questions for us, more so you, Doug, as you're an attorney, though I was a notary once, so that's pretty close, right?
There
I mean,
you
it's
go.
like the next best thing,
Yes.
right? Okay. So, Steve, I imagine you have a couple of things in the chat, maybe not.
Yeah, there's a question here from David. He says, we have a system that records critical events, hard brakes and turns. We do follow up with each driver for every event they generate. How long should we keep this information? Like messages sent to the driver and copies of the video. How many fully reviewed events per driver per month, per year is acceptable?
Yeah, I don't, like many things in life, there's not a hard and fast answer. But I
Yeah.
think what you need to do is to find a way you can show we had a critical event, we addressed it. This is the follow-up. This is where that behavior was no longer either not tolerated or hopefully was coached out of the driver on that.
So you don't have to keep it at all, but if you have a good story to tell, it doesn't hurt to keep it for 90 days, maybe longer.
At least, if not longer, even if you have like it would be onerous to keep an Excel spreadsheet of it.
Yeah.
But
Right.
if you had a record in terms of, event, action, correction, boom, down through, that could be there for a protracted period of time.
But you don't want to keep the records for driver A because he's good and dump the records for driver B, right? You got to be consistent in how you do that.
Yeah.
He's consistent. It's like I tell post-accident, and this usually sends seismic waves out there. Don't take a statement from the driver on that. And the same thing is, in certain circumstances, hold off on preventability determinations, but be consistent in the ones you do it. Might be DOT or whatever. Hold off until after the lawsuit's done.
Good. We had to have one question here from Daniel, and I don't recall that y'all talked about this, but he's asking, how is the accident rate per driver calculated? I would think depends upon whether you're talking about DOT recordable accidents or all those other things that happen. And
So it's typically
the
accidents
ratio
times a
of that
million
per
divided
number
by
of drivers,
mileage.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's fairly easy calculation. A couple of things that I thought about is one of the things I did love that you said the best defense is to not have any accidents at all. And that would be the best. And that's kind of what our company's all about. We're all about training. And Doug, I was very happy to hear you say that training has to be frequent and consistent. And that's one of the things that we try to preach here all the time is at a bare minimum, you need to be training on topics on a monthly basis. And you need to continue to do that with some frequency. And we believe that that makes you much more defendable because it shows a culture of safety, a focus on safety. Drivers are going to make mistakes from once in a while and bad things can happen, but companies shouldn't be punished just because one driver made a mistake. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but so there's one other question here just popped in. Let's see. Chris is saying, how do we calculate a good driver versus bad driver? Our company uses telematics and provide bonuses based on 80 plus score. We coach and discipline drivers with below 80 score. Drivers 70 to 80 are considered average in the telematics, but could retaining these drivers open our company up for litigation?
Well, there's no easy answer for that one. I think, obviously insurers will provide minimum standards to many of their fleets, obviously. There are industry averages which apply to fleets. You could say, look, if you're up above or below these averages, your fleet is not performing. But for me, it's really looking at the data to see if there are people who just aren't improving. Now, what you're looking for is a bright white line that says, hey, no more than X speeding events or following distance. I don't know that that exists. So, Doug, what puts you at peril in those circumstances?
I think it is continuation of the conduct that is non-conforming. So, all of us on occasion will transgress, and the telematics will report it. But if you see someone consistently doing something, and particularly after you talk to them, counsel them, they continue to do it, um, that's I think where it's problematic, and that's where it is on that. Again, Rob, like you said earlier, I think we're looking for the upward rotation in terms of the improvement of the driver in that score. It's trending, and that's what we have to look for. But for those who just can't, or even worse, won't follow up with that, then I think that's where we have the problem on it.
For sure.
Yeah. Dustin's asking, any advice on explaining the benefits of inward-facing cameras to our older drivers who feel their privacy is being violated?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just older drivers. I mean, a lot of drivers are concerned about that, and I certainly get it. Look, I'll tell you a quick anecdote, which is that when I ran a sales team for one of the providers, I had a camera in my own vehicle. It was accessible by the whole company, and my sales team decided to use me as their demo footage in front of prospects. So here you got some 50-something fella singing along to AC/DC with one hand on the wheel, right? And I was like, wait a minute, boys, that's not what we're supposed to be doing with that, right? I do think there's a concern there. Look, we all have moments where we feel that that are private, right? But the fact of the matter is, when you talk to other drivers who have them, and for periods of time, they'll all go, you know what? It's no big deal. And it's no big deal because of two things. One, if they've had an event where they need exoneration, they don't just need to show that the other vehicle was doing the right thing. They need evidence showing they were doing the right thing. They were alert. They were looking at their mirrors. They didn't have their hands off the wheel, because there's always going to be a supposition that there was some level of alertness in question or distraction in question. And that is going to be presumed and insinuated. So that is certainly helpful. The other is that really, when you talk to fleet managers, unlike my sales team, right, they're not looking at all that footage. What they're wanting is the rare exception that the system pulls up. So my advice generally is, show your drivers what you see in your dashboard. See the events and examples. And what happens is, these video providers aren't sending every video clip to those fleet managers. What they're doing is sampling and selecting the most egregious and serving them up. And so showing them what they see and how rare and infrequent it is, and that those guys aren't sitting there watching people drive all day, that helps.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, Rob. A couple things. Number one, exoneration. Show that you weren't distracted when this happened. Number two, I think it's a coaching technique. The greatest athletes in the world all use video coaching nowadays. One of the telematic providers told the story that they, when they joined the telematic provider, they had a camera put in their car, got a call within a month and said, you've got 34 stop sign events. And they go, well, stop? I stop at all stop signs. Well, you kind of stop. And they said they had no idea, to pick it up with that. Yeah. And the other thing is, from a company perspective, you can't afford a driver who is on the cell phone texting. That's a detonator right there. And guess what? That data is easy to get, either from the phone or just from the provider. And ultimately, I was at a driver's meeting where a company said, hey, could you come out and tell our drivers why we should have rear-facing cameras, on a Saturday morning when they'd rather do other things. Sounds like a great assignment, guys. Love to be there. But one of the things I pointed out to them is, you're probably being observed in your truck no more, and probably even less, than you are in your own car and automobiles. There are certain model cars out there that have a built-in camera up in the roof level on it. Now, the manufacturer won't tell anybody what's being recorded there, but you've got your airbag modules, you got your information module in your vehicle. There was an accident reconstructionist showed how they got a hit and run person based upon tracking the phone connection to the entertainment unit in the vehicle. In today's world, All that data is out there. So what's in the truck is consistent with, maybe even less than what we have when we drive our own vehicles. Unless, of course, it's that 72 that you rent, Rob. So
I had a
Everybody's
quick question for Rob. I hear this a lot, and I think it's a very valid question. The technology vendors, providers, should they be providing consultation on the metrics and the KPIs? And I listened to Doug's first, find out all the data that's coming at you, and you all of a sudden you're over. Where did all this stuff come from? What do I do with it? Is it a reasonable expectation for your technology vendor to provide some recommendations?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. You know, I wrote an article about this recently after speaking to a lot of the different technology providers, and some of them are really very good about talking to best practices. They get to peek in a lot of other tents, right? Anonymous tents where they go, okay, here's how other fleets are managing to this. Here's how we can dial it back. Here's the stuff that drivers respond to. Here's the patterns that we're going to see happen. Reality is, with telematics data, once you get it, a whole bunch of it is going to be following distance initially because nobody provides adequate following distance. Just a thing, right? And then the next thing is, okay, we're going to get control of that. We're going to get control of this. Those guys really do have a view into the world, and they can be very helpful. And they can, the good ones with good systems can configure that stuff, right? So they can determine sampling rates. They can set thresholds. They can alert you to patterns and slopes. So yeah, I would lean on them really heavily, but also in the selection process, really vet out the ones that have more capabilities there. Some of them have systems that aren't that mature and don't have those capabilities. Others, they really can configure that stuff, and they're very helpful.
and in today's
So
world,
ordering a system off of Amazon's not going to give you much consultation.
The one in the Uber, maybe not.
in today's world, Mark, we have providers who not only will have the data, what would be a closed AI system of the particular trucking company, but an open system that would have anonymized data throughout their other providers. So that would help with benchmarking overall, as well as within your company.
Doug, I wanted to ask you about one of the questions that came into the chat, because I got asked this a lot, is that I had some fleets that say, hey, we only require the driver-facing camera on drivers for the first 2 years of driving or accident-free, and they earn their way to not have an inward-facing camera. Is that a dangerous model?
Potentially. I understand it's a great training model, particularly if you can show that there's not the adverse behavior there. I think where you run into problems, though, is when you literally flip the switch.
Right.
And the accident happens 2 years and 1 day later, and gee, we don't know if they were distracted or not. Yesterday you would have known. Last week you would have known. A year ago you would have known. And you've taken that, and why did you do that? So I think potentially on that, but again, it's just a matter of a company policy and company protection that why don't you want the camera there? And my inclination, at the risk of being insensitive, but what are you doing that you're afraid is going to be seen? Is the thought that I have.
Well, I'm singing along to AC/DC, Doug. I mean, that's what I'm doing. It's a little embarrassing, but there was one other question that somebody asked, and Doug, I won't even pretend to opine on independent contractor tests. But when we talk about direction and control and independent contractors, what degree of this data and the technology puts a fleet at risk for claims that they overly exerted direction and control and were by de facto employers instead of working contractors?
Robert, I was going to tell you my screen froze up when you started that question, but unfortunately it didn't. At the risk of being very lawyerly and the frustration not only of trucking companies but to myself as well, there is no answer to that. All I can say is the more you exert, the more you require, the more you start to bring them into the employee realm and out of the independent contractor realm.
Right.
In terms of requiring and this, it's very difficult in today's world. The test varies. We're in the process of a changeover test from administrations,
Right.
Where we're going with that. but I would just think in terms of, number one, what elements of control or do we have in the independent contractors? Number two, do we really need to do so on it? And if you don't absolutely need to do so, I would stay away from it and just diminish your exposure there. There's no black and white. It's just shades of gray.
Right. No single test is definitive.
Yeah.
So this could flip the balance. It might not flip the balance, right? For sure.
Good. Awesome. All right. I don't see any other questions popping in. Let me check down here. One thing I'd like to do is one of the areas that you mentioned earlier was frequent and consistent training. And as I said a little bit earlier, that's exactly our focus and what we preach to our clients and we talk to our prospects about to develop and show that culture of safety. So if you're not a current customer and you'd like to know more about our system, if you could answer the poll question there, we'll be happy to reach out and talk to you about it. And also those of you that are certified directors of safety under the NATME program, if you let us know, we will send you a certificate of attendance so you can claim your recertification 0.2 of a point, I think, for an hour-long program. So, but I just wanted to thank both of y'all, Rob and Doug. Really, really good information. I think the thing that I took away most from it, obviously, is I was glad to hear that training is key here because the more you can do that, the more likelihood you have to prevent an accident, which eliminates a lot of this stuff. But also, if you have policies, make sure they're in writing, make sure you train everybody on the policies and whatever those are to follow those policies. And I think that's just logical, good information to do those sorts of things. So, Mark, did you have any final comments, or Rob, you, Doug, any final comments? Because we're about at the
I,
end here.
I would just add when you determine that you do have an actionable event, that you take action and that you be able to document that. I'm sure, Doug, you've heard this over and over in court. Yeah, I told them not to do that again, and that doesn't get you anywhere. You've got to be able to document date, time, and place. Yes, we had an event. We discussed it. We didn't, forget about it. And it's, I hear all the time, I did something, but I can't prove it.
Yes, Steve, let me second what you're saying in there in terms of training. The plaintiff attack is a triad. The second leg of that triad is training, negligent hiring, training, supervision. The easiest one to take away is the training. Right. Is to, just do it, early and often. And, there's an election joke out there that I'm not going to make, but that's what you want to do with the training the same way there, is to get after that. So, no, invaluable what you guys do. And I think in terms of the protection of the company.
Well, we think so. And so, there's kind of a multi-pronged approach here. If you train enough, you can reduce the number of crashes at the beginning, but you also have to make sure everybody understands what your policies and procedures are. And so training has a lot to do with a lot of the things that we talked about today. Exactly. But really good information, Rob, Doug, thank you so much. I don't see any other questions coming in. Oh, wait a minute. Somebody wanted to know what's your opinion on sharing video or sending to drivers for self-coaching?
I mean, my view is that it, much like the driver-centric change in the moment, it can be very effective. People sometimes don't realize their behaviors until they're pointed out to them.
Yeah.
And when they see them, they go, oh, look at that, I was weaving. Oh, look at that, I wasn't providing. That can be very effective in people saying, you know what? Yeah, maybe I do need to look in the mirror on this one.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Totally.
There's a couple theories of behavioral psychology, which, of course, having no prior or training in, I read a book once about. And one of them is that if you show somebody what their conduct is, it is more readily recalled when they face that situation again. If you show, say, at a driver's meeting, not in a punitive manner or diminished, but show what other people's behavior is, that same recall will come back to them so that they can avoid that situation having seen what that person encountered. You've sensitized it to them. So I think it's invaluable both ways.
What's your opinion on providing information or videos of a driver that did all the right things, show the positive, the near misses, the things that uh, we hope the drivers are doing out there? I think that kind of a positive message from time to time is very important too.
There's a telematic provider out there that gives positive points to drivers
Yes.
for maintaining following distance, not having hard brakes, etc. And I think that's where a lot of safety programs or a lot of safety folks get in, have problems that they look at their job as being a gotcha job.
Yeah.
And it's not. It is to develop the culture. I think the ultimate definition of integrity is doing what you're supposed to do when nobody's looking.
Yes.
And I think that's the ultimate success of safety out there and what we need, because we're the only industry in the world that has folks that operate heavy equipment outside of our vision with the motoring public, and I think that's the integrity we need out there to instill in our drivers.
I agree 100%. Very good. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and information today. Just a reminder, those of you still out there, we'll be sending out an email that'll have a link to this recording, so you can share that with some other folks. And if you have specific questions, I guess, for Doug or Rob, you can reach out to me. You all should have my email, and I will get in touch with Doug and Rob and forward on your questions, concerns. So, Rob, thank you very much. Doug, thank you. Mark, as always, thanks for joining us. And we'll look forward to, by the way, on the 21st of November, we're having another webinar, and we'll have Rebecca Brewster from ATRI is going to go through the top 10 industry concerns, which I'm sure a lot of you have already heard. But it's always interesting to hear her talk about a lot of the details around those industry concerns. So that's coming up 10 a.m. on November 21st. Very good, gentlemen. Thank you all very much. Thanks
guys.
everybody for coming, and everybody have a good, safe rest of the week.
You do.
Thank you all very much.
Bye-bye.